There are rows and rows, floor to ceiling, of Jackson's possessions, most of it never seen publicly since he died. This warehouse is 20,000 square feet. Every inch of it is full.
For 17 years, the doors stayed shut. No cameras, no reporters, no curious fans, just silence behind a padlocked warehouse on the grounds of the most famous private estate in the world. And then, without warning, they opened it. What they found inside wasn't just stuff. It was Michael Jackson, the real one, frozen in time, untouched, unfiltered. Cars he never let go. Handwritten notes. Dreams he had scribbled down at 21. So, who exactly was the man behind those locked doors? Stay with me. This one goes deep. The warehouse the world forgot. Let's set the scene. Neverland Ranch, Santa Barbara County, California, 5 miles north of Los Olivos, about as remote and private as 2,700 acres of pure fantasy can be. Train stations, carousel rides, a private zoo, lush sculpted gardens. Michael Jackson purchased it in 1988, and from the moment he moved in, he started building a world that answered only to him. But on a quieter corner of the property, away from the rides, away from the storybook grounds, sat 5 warehouses, locked, off limits, built entirely under Michael's direction. Not even his closest associates were allowed inside without permission. When Michael died on June 25, 2009, unexpectedly, tragically, on the eve of what was supposed to be his triumphant "This Is It" comeback, those warehouses stayed exactly as he had left them. His estate, drowning in over $500 million of debt, had more pressing matters to deal with. And so the warehouses just waited. But waiting has a weird way of turning ordinary things into myths. Because once enough time passes, people stop thinking like archivists and start thinking like treasure hunters. Stories started circulating online. Fans convinced themselves there were unreleased songs hidden in crates. Others believed there were rooms full of costumes nobody had ever photographed. Some swore Michael had kept alternate stage concepts, unfinished ideas, secret journals. Entire forums built theories around what those warehouses could contain. And honestly, it wasn't that ridiculous. This was Michael Jackson. This was a man who famously saved sketches, recorded ideas constantly, and approached his life almost like a director shooting a movie nobody else was allowed to watch. Former visitors over the years described seeing glimpses of stacked boxes and preserved memorabilia, but never being allowed close enough to understand what they were looking at. That only made the mystery bigger, because the less people knew, the more they imagined. And eventually, the warehouses became bigger than storage buildings. They became the last unopened chapter of Michael Jackson's story. 17 years. Think about that. A new iPhone generation, a pandemic, an entire cultural shift, and those doors never opened. That is, until recently, when the world finally got a look at what Michael had been hiding. But before we get to what's inside, why did Michael need a secret warehouse in the first place? And what does it say about the life he was really living? Neverland, the kingdom behind the fantasy. People always talk about Neverland like it was some kind of ego project, a superstar's playground, excessive and absurd. But those who actually spent time there tell a different story. Neverland wasn't built for show. It was built for escape. Michael had a 2-story bedroom suite secured with a private security code panel and a peephole in the door, so he could see who was coming before deciding whether to let them in. That's not luxury. That's someone who felt hunted. And honestly, given the way the media and allegations had been circling him since the early 1990s, can you really blame him? Inside Neverland, time operated differently. There was a working railway, a movie theater, a carousel that Michael had hand-selected. Disney actually built him a custom Peter Pan diorama, not bought off a shelf, custom made, because when you're Michael Jackson, Disney shows up with gifts. Elizabeth Taylor, one of his closest friends, gave him a gift inscribed, "MJ Love E.T." The kind of intimacy you don't expect from two of the biggest names in Hollywood history. The gardens weren't just decorative either. They were deliberately designed to mix fantasy with reality. Real flowers, real trees, arranged to feel like you'd stepped sideways into a dream. Michael didn't just live at Neverland. He curated it the way a painter builds a studio. Every corner was intentional. And maybe that's the part people miss when they talk about Neverland. Because if you strip away the headlines and the celebrity mythology, Neverland starts looking less like extravagance and more like somebody trying to control the one thing fame took away from him: atmosphere. Michael couldn't control tabloids. He couldn't control rumors. He couldn't control whether people loved him one year and turned on him the next. But inside Neverland, he controlled everything: the music, the colors, the timing, the weather of the experience. Guests talked about arriving and feeling like they'd crossed into a completely different emotional reality. Employees described Michael changing details constantly, moving objects, adjusting spaces, preserving certain displays exactly as they were. That explained something important. If somebody puts that much care into what guests see, imagine the thought that went into the spaces nobody was supposed to see. So, what exactly was in those warehouses he kept locked away, even from his own people? The Boy from Gary, How It All Began. To understand what was in those warehouses and why it mattered so much to Michael, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not Neverland, not the moonwalk. Back to a tiny two-bedroom house at 2300 Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana. Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, the seventh of 9 children. His father, Joe, worked the steel mill. His mother, Catherine, played piano and sang. They were crowded, working class, and intensely musical. Joe Jackson recognized early that his sons had something special, and by 1963, when Michael was just 5 years old, he had formed the Jackson Brothers, which would eventually become the Jackson 5. Michael was the standout from day one. Audiences couldn't take their eyes off him. By the time he was 7, he was performing in nightclubs, not watching, performing. He later told interviewers that he saw striptease acts, grown men throwing punches, adults behaving in ways no child should witness. "I grew up on stage," he said. "I grew up in nightclubs." His childhood, by his own account, was traded for rehearsals and road trips and spotlight. In 1969, the Jackson 5 signed with Motown Records. 4 #1 singles in a row: I Want You Back, ABC, The Love You Save, I'll Be There. Michael was 11 years old and already the most naturally charismatic performer alive. By 1979, with the release of Off the Wall, he had arrived as a solo force. And then, in 1982, Thriller happened, the best-selling album of all time, with over 70 million copies sold worldwide. He won 13 Grammy Awards. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, once with the Jackson 5 in 1997, and again as a solo artist in 2001. He invented a visual language for music videos that the entire industry still borrows from. But the weight of that trajectory, the stolen childhood, the abusive rehearsal schedule, the relentless pressure, never left him. And in many ways, Neverland was the answer to all of it. It was the childhood he never had, rebuilt brick by the man who had every resource in the world but couldn't get back the one thing he'd lost. Which makes what they found inside those warehouses all the more heartbreaking and all the more revealing. What was actually inside those 5 warehouses? Okay, here's where things get genuinely fascinating. According to a recent YouTube documentary published in May 2026, when the warehouses were finally opened after 17 years, what greeted the people inside wasn't chaos, it was preservation. Deliberate, careful, almost obsessive preservation. Like someone had frozen a life mid-sentence and walked away. There were Rolls Royces, multiple, cars spanning 30 years that Michael had owned and simply never gotten rid of. They weren't stored haphazardly, they were lined up as if waiting, as if expecting him to come back. There were his Grammys, the actual ones, sitting in a warehouse. There were personal items that hit differently than trophies, his original socks, the exact shoes he had worn on stage. Not replicas, the real ones. A man who could have bought anything in the world had kept his worn shoes. And then there were the documents. A 1979 tour itinerary that contained a handwritten mission statement from a 21-year-old Michael Jackson. MJ will be my new name. No more Michael Jackson. I want a whole new character. He wasn't just a kid performing his songs. He was designing himself. Building a persona the way an architect builds a building, with blueprints. There were notebooks, a handwritten manifesto, private materials that the public had never seen. And there was the Peter Pan diorama from Disney, still intact. The carousel. All of it quietly waiting. And what makes that image hit harder is this. Michael wasn't known for throwing things away. People close to his world had talked for years about how sentimental he could be. Gifts mattered. Costumes mattered. Objects connected to moments mattered. That sounds small until you realize what fame does to people. Most celebrities simplify. They move houses, rotate possessions, replace memories. Michael seemed to do the opposite. He archived, he kept, he was preserved. And suddenly those warehouses stop looking random. You start seeing them almost like chapters. This shelf was from one era. That car was another. Those notebooks belonged to a version of Michael nobody outside ever met. That's what made the stories feel emotional instead of luxurious. Because finding 10 expensive cars tells you someone had money. Finding old socks and handwritten dreams tells you somebody was trying not to forget themselves. The thing is, nothing in those warehouses suggested a man running from himself. It suggested a man trying desperately to hold on to himself, underneath all the fame and the scrutiny and the allegations and the reinventions. So why did it take 17 years for anyone to open those doors? And what happened to Neverland after Michael died? What happened to Neverland? Michael Jackson left Neverland for the last time in November 2003, the day after a dramatic police raid linked to child molestation allegations involving 13-year-old Gavin Arvizo. He was charged in 2004 and acquitted on all counts in June 2005. But he never went back to Neverland, not once. The estate sat largely empty, its operating costs astronomical. By 2008, Michael's finances had collapsed so badly that Colony Capital bought the defaulted loan on the property for $22.5 million. Michael transferred the title to Sycamore Valley Ranch Company, LLC, and sold off a portion of his property rights for $35 million. He then moved into a rented mansion in Los Angeles at $100,000 a month, and it was there that he died on June 25, 2009. After his death, Neverland went to market. It was listed for $100 million in 2015 and ultimately sold in 2020 to real estate billionaire Ron Burkle for just $22 million. Construction crews moved in soon after. Then, in 2024, film crews arrived, permitted as a production called Maven, which was actually the working title for the Michael Jackson biopic, Michael. They filmed at Neverland from April to May 2024 with helicopters, stunt doubles, and a full crew. The plan was to shoot key scenes there, including a reenactment of the infamous 2003 police raid. But a legal complication stopped them cold. A clause in a 1994 civil settlement with Jordan Chandler, one of Jackson's alleged victims, who received a reported $23 million, legally prevented any adaptation from depicting those allegations. The Neverland scenes were already in the can when the production team was told they couldn't use them. Michael. The biopic was released on April 24, 2026, starring Jaffer Jackson, Michael's own nephew, in the lead role, with Coleman Domingo as Joe Jackson and Nia Long as Catherine. The film opened Neverland back up in the public imagination even as the actual property remained largely sealed off. Here's what nobody talks about enough: what happened to Michael Jackson's money after he died. The most profitable dead man in music history. At the time of Michael Jackson's death, his estate carried over $500 million in debt, over 65 creditor claims, some debt in default. It was, by any measure, a financial disaster. What followed is one of the most extraordinary business turnarounds in entertainment history. The estate's executors, veteran entertainment attorney John Branca and music industry insider John McClain, moved aggressively. In 2016, they sold half of the estate's stake in Sony/ATV Music Publishing for $750 million. That catalog included rights to songs by the Beatles, courtesy of Michael's famous 1985 purchase of the ATV catalog for $47.5 million. Then in February 2024, they did it again, this time selling a 50% stake in Michael's own publishing and master recordings to Sony Music Group in a deal reportedly valued at over $1.2 billion, with the estate receiving around $600 million. Catherine Jackson tried to block the deal in court, arguing that Michael had explicitly not wanted his assets sold. A California appellate court disagreed and upheld the executor's authority. Beyond the catalog deals, the estate kept generating. MJ, the musical on Broadway. MJ, the musical on Broadway, which opened in May 2024 at the Richard Rodgers Theater and has run for over 500 performances, has grossed significant revenue, spawning a U.S. national tour, a West End production in London, and international stagings as far as Australia and Asia. Cirque du Soleil's Michael Jackson One in Las Vegas, extended through 2030, has now played to over 5 million guests. Then the biopic, then the streaming numbers. Forbes declared Michael Jackson the highest-earning deceased celebrity of 2025, with $105 million in pre-tax earnings in a single year. Since his death, his estate has earned an estimated $3.5 billion. That number almost feels impossible until you realize something strange happened after Michael died. His image changed. Not completely, not cleanly, but noticeably. People who grew up with him introduced him to their kids. Streaming created audiences that never lived through the scandals or the media frenzy. TikTok rediscovered the performances. YouTube rediscovered the interviews. A whole generation met Michael backward, not through tabloid covers, but through music videos and live performances. And that created a bizarre effect. The further time moved forward, the more people started separating the artist, the icon, the businessman, and the person, which may explain why something as simple as a warehouse opening suddenly became headline material. People weren't chasing objects, they were chasing proximity. One more chance to understand somebody who spent most of his life impossible to fully understand. To put that in context, one estate lawyer told Forbes, "When it comes to estate earnings, it's MJ, then an enormous canyon, then everybody else. But not everyone is celebrating." In July 2025, Paris Jackson, Michael's daughter, filed court objections questioning legal fees and what she called premium payouts, demanding greater transparency in how estate funds are managed. A court later rejected most of her claims, siding with the executors. The family, it seems, is still fighting over the empire Michael left behind. But here's the question that ties everything together. What does a locked warehouse, a 17-year silence, and a $3.5 billion estate tell us about who Michael Jackson really was? The paradox of Michael Jackson. Here's what strikes me about all of this. A man who had every luxury imaginable kept his worn-out shoes in a warehouse. A man worth billions when alive died in debt in a rented house. A man who wrote at 21 that he wanted to become a whole new character spent the rest of his life trying to explain who he actually was. The warehouses weren't just storage. They were the parts of Michael that fame couldn't reach. The boy from Gary who never got his birthdays. The collector who held on to everything because everything had once been taken from him. While the world argued about his legacy, debated his guilt or innocence, built museums and filed lawsuits and made billions off his name, those 5 quiet buildings on a locked California estate held the version of him that didn't have a PR team. And now, 17 years later, those buildings are open. The cars are there. The shoes are there. The handwritten notes are there. The dream, scribbled by a 21-year-old who wanted to be something bigger than himself, is still there. The more time passes, the more organized and profitable the legacy becomes, but also the more human it looks. Because when you strip away the Thriller jacket and the moonwalk and the $3.5 billion estate, what you find in those warehouses is just a person who loved his Rolls Royces, kept his socks, and wrote his dreams down on paper. Michael Jackson was never just a performer. He was a system, a legacy, a global industry. But he was also, clearly and unmistakably, a human being trying his best to hold on to himself in a world that wouldn't let him. And maybe that's the real story those warehouses have been keeping all along. And that's the full story of Michael Jackson's secret warehouse, the man behind the myth, the empire behind the estate, and the shoes that outlasted everything. If this one made you see Michael a little differently, drop a comment below and let me know what hit you hardest. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, because next week we're diving into another story so wild, so layered, so completely underreported that you're going to want to be there from the very first second. You don't want to miss it.